We'd like to thank the following sponsors for helping provide this video.
The reason that hopefully most of you have come tonight, our speaker, Moreira. Mario is going to be talking on Agile, the importance of Agile readiness, success factors for transformation to Agile. And a lot of these concepts are included in his newly published book. He's been kind enough to donate 3 copies that we'll be raffling off. And if you don't win the raffle, he has some copies for sale at a special discount price for the evening, so we appreciate that. Mario has been a very active member of the Agile community for many years. He was vice president at Fidelity and bringing the initial Agile work into Fidelity. He was instrumental as Agile evangelist in CA, and he's now a consultant in Agile and Lean for Emergent, and working at various other clients. And I'm looking forward to Mario's speech, so welcome, Mario.
Thank you so much, Dave. Appreciate it. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Agile New England. I do appreciate this opportunity and all the people that both volunteer and support this organization. I mean, this is really a great thing that this organization does because it brings a lot of Agile-minded people together. And I just want to give a round of applause to Dave and his crew again. So as mentioned, my name is Moreira. I'm here to talk about the importance of Agile readiness. And some of this is a contributing factor to the fact that people are implementing Agile, but sometimes they're not getting the benefits that they thought they should. So I'm going to share with you some success factors that can help you actually transform, so I'm using the word transform, to an Agile culture. So a little bit about myself. As you can see what Karen mentioned, I've written a number of books in the Agile space, but I've also been involved in the Agile community since about 1998, when at Fidelity we brought in Ken Schwaber to implement Scrum. And that's actually before Scrum was actually in its final version. So we got the opportunity to explore and adapt it with him. And that was a great experience. And since then, I've been involved in a number of opportunities as it relates to Agile, a lot at the enterprise level. So not just at the team level or product level, but at the enterprise level. I also have a blog that if you're interested in checking out at some point, it's called Agile Adoption Roadmap, or put Agile Adoption and maybe my name and you can find it on Google. And as mentioned, I just did release this book called Being Agile. And this is really a book that is based on a lot of adoption and transformation experience I've had over the years. Because I started to see there was a lot of patterns in getting to transformation, or also anti-patterns for maybe not quite the adoption that you're looking for. So as I started to accumulate this, I started to develop my own deployment model when I go into teams and organizations. And I found very similar patterns, and I'm going to share some of those with you today. And as mentioned, I'm going to be giving 3 copies away on behalf of Agile New England, and then I'll have some on sale for, actually they're normally $40. I'm actually having a special discount for only $20 a copy, if you'd like to grab a copy afterwards. So what's the journey today? The first is, I'm going to state a hypothesis, and we'll see if it comes true. I'm also going to reintroduce the Agile principles, and then share with you what I call the rich deployment model. So the first thing I want to talk about is, why am I doing this session in the first place? Part of the reason is there tends to be too much focus on the mechanics and too little focus on the culture, on the Agile culture, and getting to that culture. Because one of the things I've learned over time is, if you're just implementing the mechanics, you may not get to that cultural change that you're really looking for. The second is people aren't seeing the business benefits from going to Agile. And part of that is because when they go into it, they don't even, quite frankly, think about aligning Agile with their business strategy. It just, if something happens, that's great. Otherwise, who knows? The other is folks are not seeing enough success in their projects. So some of you may be familiar with the chaos survey of 2011, 2012 that said in the waterfall world, 14% of projects were successful, and the rest were either challenged or failed. In the Agile space, a lot of people would assume that number is really high. Well, it is higher than 14%, but it's only 42%. Okay? So what does that tell you? That's still, it's chaos. Chaos report. Yeah, chaos, go, you can search online.
Still 3-1.
It's still 3-1, but it's still only 42%. So by far and away, Agile is better. But what that tells you is there's still other factors going on. Or maybe the way that people are pursuing Agile isn't as thorough as it could be. And some of this gets to, and we're going to talk about it, you can see me hit on it again and again, it's because there's way too much focus on the mechanical elements and not near as much focus on the cultural elements. So why is this? As mentioned, there's a lot of companies doing Agile for Agile's sake. How many of you have been in a company that's doing Agile because it seems to be the thing to do? Raise your hand, right? And that's, it might be kind of cool for a little while, but then when you realize there's no attachment to business strategy or the right reasons for doing it. It's the bandwagon opportunity, right? Everybody's on that bandwagon. The next is, as I've already mentioned, there's so much focus on doing Agile. So I'm going to use that word a bit. Doing Agile versus being Agile, which is the title of my book. And that's because people seem to gravitate towards those mechanics, but it doesn't mean they necessarily understand why they're doing them. How many people have seen that in their organizations? Doing, yep, good. And then there's also the focus, what is Agile primarily about? Agile's primarily about getting to customer value. Getting to customer value. It's not about doing it fast. It's not about productivity. All these things certainly are benefits, but it's ultimately about getting to customer value. And that's another message that has to come clear when you're implementing Agile. So, now I'm going to ask you guys a question. And I'm going to give you a little advance notice. This could be a trick question. Okay, so raise your hand. How many of you are quite certain you know what Agile is? Raise your hand. Okay, I got 1, 2 people. Come on, guys. 3, 4, 5. Okay. Yeah, I know, because I said it was a trick question, right? You guys are like, okay, I'm going to back off until this guy comes clean. So, let me ask the question. Is Agile an iterative and incremental framework? How many think it's an iterative and incremental framework? Okay, I see some hands. How many people think it's a set of practices and techniques? I see some more hands. How many think it's a software development lifecycle methodology or process? Raise your hand. Okay. How many think it's a collection of tools? You know, like Rally, version 1, Jira. Okay. Yeah. Or how many think it's all of the above? Okay. So can someone do a drum roll, please? The correct answer is, it is nothing more and nothing less than a set of values and principles. Some of you are probably feeling a little stunned. It is nothing more and nothing less than a set of values and principles. How many of you have been to agilemanifesto.org? When you go there, does it explain that Agile is a lifecycle methodology or an iterative and incremental framework, or what does it actually tell you there at that site? They first share the values, and then there's a link to the principles. So this is an important message, because I can guarantee you, all of you have visited the Agile Manifesto and probably have walked through the values and principles. How many have? Raise your hand. This is very common. But then what happens? What's the next step? Speak up.
Learn the methodology.
Then you learn, right? You immediately learn a methodology, right? And then this gets completely foreshadowed. How many has that happened to in your organization? This has been shared, and then you immediately jump into a methodology, like Scrum or XP or Kanban or whatever it is. Okay? This doesn't mean those things are bad. It's just this is the crux of what Agile is. And unfortunately, we spend so little time here. And that's because we focus on the mechanics and blow right through the values and principles that we're supposed to align with, mentally align with. So, in order to cross this chasm that you see here, the only way to do it is that you have made that mental and cultural leap towards the Agile mindset. We're going to talk about this a little bit more. And there's a lot of discussion in the Agile sphere that people ask, well, is Agile mainstream yet? Have anybody seen some of those discussions? Is Agile mainstream, right? And some people say, yeah, it's already mainstream. Well, I contend it's not mainstream at all. I contend that we have, many people are still at the early adopters, and the reason why is there's so many people that are doing something like Agile but have not adopted the actual values and principles and are not operating in that manner. How many would concur with me on this? Okay. And so this is a fundamental challenge. I have a chapter in the book that discusses this, and I had a really hard time. I rewrote this chapter 3 times. And the reason why is the very first time, I just wrote it like, oh yeah, there's at least 50% of the companies or 70% of the companies or more, depending on the studies you see, that are doing Agile. So we must be in the late adopter area, right? Or what do they call the late majority, right? And so, but then I started thinking about it. Well, that's for those companies that were doing Agile, might be in the late majority. But for those who are truly being Agile, I contend we're still in the early adopter. Okay. So with that in mind, there's a piece of paper, there's some pages at the end of each row. I'd like you to take one and pass it down. Take one and pass it down. I have a quiz for everybody. Again, this is based on my hypothesis. I have a quiz for everybody. If I'm short on, we can always... Okay, now, you see the blue text there? You can't peek at each other's paper when we're doing this, okay? No peeking. And if you don't have a pen, I have an extra one here in case people need it, but hopefully everybody has a pen or some writing utensil. You need one? You need one too? Anybody have any extra pens? I only have one. Okay, gentleman up here needs one. Oh, we got a bunch over there. Pens. Yeah, I'll take that. Thank you. Okay. Is everybody more or less ready? So here's the first question. Can you name Name as many of the Scrum events as you can. Name as many of the Scrum events as you can. Okay? This is not a trick question. Name as many of the Scrum events as you can.
You don't mean like the Scrum Gathering?
What's that?
Not the Scrum Gathering.
No, not the Scrum Gathering. Oh, yes, the ones actually in the Scrum Guide, as illustrated in the Scrum Guide. Yeah, not Deep Agile and not. So, as they're written in the Scrum Guide, name as many of the 4 Scrum events as you can. Okay? Okay, now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. And I'm going to ask you to name as many of the 12 Agile principles as you can. Name as many of the 12 Agile principles as you can. And don't worry, this isn't going to be graded. You're not going to lose your Agile certification or anything like that. And don't worry, I didn't do so well the first time either, okay? Just to make you guys feel good. So name as many of the Agile principles as you can. And then the third question is, and you can just either write it on the back or somewhere on the side. In any of the Agile deployments, or the more recent ones that you have been involved with, what percentage of time do you spend educating on and gauging whether you are following the Agile values and principles? Is it A, you can just put the letters here, is it A, 0 to 5%, 5 to 10%, 11 to 25, 25 to 50, 51 to 75, and 76 to 100. There is no right or wrong answer. All of this information, just so you know, it's all going to be a roll-up. It's going to be turned into a study, an article that I'll share back with you guys at some point. Okay? And I'm actually, because I'm speaking at the Agile Software Development Conference next week, I'll be collecting more data there as well. So it'll be rolled up into a bigger pool. So is anyone not done yet? Okay, so if you're done, if you could start passing them all back this way. You don't have to put your name on it or anything. You probably don't want to put your name on it, right? Yes, thank you. If you could collect those, well, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so how many of you felt a little humbled when you were doing that exercise? Okay, so I have, in addition, collected other data, and this is actually a fairly telling situation in the Agile world. So, why do you think there's so much focus on the mechanics and so little on the cultural elements? Anyone? Go ahead, Dave.
Changing the mechanics is easier than changing the culture.
Changing mechanics is easier. Go ahead.
Easier to measure mechanics.
It's easier to measure mechanics. Bob?
Changing culture is difficult.
Changing the culture is difficult. Karen?
We're used to thinking in terms of mechanics. We're a mechanical organization, and so we want to do what we know, which is changing the mechanics.
Particularly engineering organizations.
Yeah,
Right?
we don't need it, that's awesome.
We don't deal in the soft stuff, right? Go ahead,
It's a
Norman.
lot easier to observe mechanics than it is to observe.
It's a lot easier to observe mechanics. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
There are too many people out there training on the mechanics and not enough training on the culture.
Okay, there's too many people out there training on the mechanics and not enough on the culture. That's huge. Thank you.
I was gonna say that often Agile is kind of sold as a silver bullet. You just implement this thing and then everything gets all better.
Often Agile is sold as a silver bullet. Somehow you do it and everything is better. When in fact, it is, quite frankly, a journey. Yes?
Yeah,
And Mark?
It's a lot easier to sell mechanics to management than to sell thinking about doing principles.
It's a lot easier to sell mechanics to management than it is principles. And I can tell you as an Agile consultant, that is very true. And I think there's an overemphasis by a lot of us consultants because we know it's easier. That's often how we introduce or lead it. Yes, go ahead, Peter.
The executives think it's a sort of a development-y thing, and therefore they don't buy in as much.
That's right.
Cultural part.
It's often targeted at the teams. Those teams should go do Agile. How many have heard that? Let's get those teams to go do Agile, right? When in fact they should be participating. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, culture is political, and so you're standing on a landmine.
Yeah.
Culture can be hard because it is very political. Yes,
It's much better studied at the small mechanical level.
it's much better studied so that you can provide more evidence in an easier way. Yes, Dave.
The mechanical changes are at the lower level, but the cultural change has to happen above.
At all levels, right? Go ahead, Ed, and then Mark.
Isn't there more emphasis in the Agile movement itself on the mechanics as opposed to
Yeah.
the culture?
So isn't there a lot of movement on the mechanical elements by Agile? How many have heard of Scrum Alliance? How many have heard of Scrum Master certification? How many have Scrum Master certification? Right? That's like, it's an easy thing to do. In 2 days, I can become a Scrum Master. What in the world does that even mean? Right? It should be a Scrum Minor. When you get the certification, that's as far as you're getting, right? You don't get to be a master until you have many years of experience. Okay, so good point. Yes, Mark?
It's a heck of a lot easier to sabotage principles than to sabotage.
Easier to sabotage principles than mechanics. Okay, anything else before we move on? Good discussion. Very good points here, too. So, with that in mind, let's revisit the principles. And hopefully, as we're going through this, we're only going to spend a couple of minutes on it, but this will refresh your memory, because I'm sure you've seen all this before. So what's the first principle? Now, I've digested this just a little bit, because a lot of the principles are like full sentences. But the first principle focuses on satisfying customer with valuable software. So that value is very important, that you're providing software that is valuable to the customer. The second is that you welcome change. You welcome change. So you don't fight it or resist it, you welcome change. Third, you allow for frequent and continuous delivery. Frequent and continuous delivery. So you can be getting value to the customer on a frequent basis. One of the key principles is bringing the business and development together, making them work together. In some of the methods, you see like product owner and team, things like that. The key is bringing them together so they have a better reciprocal and collaborative relationship. You also want motivated individuals who are trusted. So both have to go hand in hand. If they're not going to be trusted, they're not going to be motivated. Okay? But you want them motivated and charged up. Because another principle we're going to see soon is called self-organizing teams. And so you need the motivated individuals who can be trusted, because that will also help with the self-motivated, self-organized teams. It also recommends face-to-face communications. Now we know in this world, how many have been on distributed projects before? Right? All of us. But are there ways to still have face-to-face communication when you have distributed projects? Absolutely. Skype, for no other thing. Google Plus, I mean, there's Hangout. There's tons of tools out there now for that. And this one's key. The measure of progress in an agile world is working software. If you're in a waterfall project and you've gotten 50% of the way through, and you've delivered no working software, from an agile mindset, what percentage of progress are you? 0. Okay? Working software is the measure of progress. Sustainable pace is critical. That means you allow the team to operate at a pace that they can work continuously. And 80 hours a week is not that pace, right? And you allow the team to decide that. You also seek technical excellence, looking for ways to ensure your QA, configuration management, development, architecture, design are working in top form. You also look for simplicity, and this is a hard one. This is one of the hardest ones. Because what simplicity really means, it's not just looking at building software in as simple a manner as possible. It's also focusing on what you shouldn't be doing or building as well. And I mentioned the self-organizing teams, where you allow the teams to control their destiny and organize around the work. And then finally, that you allow for continuous reflection for improvement. We call them lessons learned, retrospectives, doesn't really matter. Point is, you allow for a continuous reflection for improvement. Okay. So does this help refresh your memories? Good, good. I just wanted to make sure I inserted that information back into your head. How many think now they do a lot better on that quiz? Raise your hand. Yeah, you want that sheet back, don't you? Yeah. Okay. So, this is a great Greek. Basically here, if you want to be a good farmer, you have to know the nature of your soil. If you want to be a great agile consultant or agile champion of any form, you need to know the conditions in which you are working. So now allow me to introduce what I call the rich deployment model. It stands for ready, implement, coach, and hone. However, you'll see it's in a circle or a cycle. It's not meant to be phased. It's meant to be iterative and emergent. So it's a deployment model that is specifically geared to get you to transformation, or will highlight why you're not getting there. Okay? It's really a risk management approach to deployment of Agile. And it primarily focuses on readiness. And part of the reason why is there's so much focus on the mechanics of the implement, right? 90% of the Agile books out there talk about implementing. Here's how you'd implement this, here's how you'd implement that. And they're very useful. Just my book refers to those books during that point. My book mostly focuses on readiness because that's the gap, we've already heard it discussed here, that's the gap that's missing from many of the books. It might be mentioned in a chapter or two, but not the full book. And there's a couple of other good books out there that do, but the majority of Agile books tend to focus on the mechanics of the implement. This also aligns with the inspect and adapt framework. That's why you see hone in there. Anything you consider in readiness and implement, you're going to have to reflect on it and hone it over time. And then you see a coaching circle around it. Because what this suggests is if you don't have someone who knows what Agile, a change in Agile culture looks like, then how do you know you've gone Agile? Right? I've seen some companies will make the attempt, and if you have a brilliant Agile champion, it can happen, but oftentimes you don't really know if you get there if you've never been there before. So I recommend some sort of resource such as that. So, what is the objective of readiness? It's to condition the soil, in this case our minds, prior to growing the seeds, or in this case prior to growing the people and the practices. There's a lot more focus on the what and why, and there's focus on assessing the current environment so we get a sense of where we are today, we understand our context. That's, to me, very critical, because every company I've ever worked at is very different, completely different. And you have to understand where they are today before you can really help them. And in fact, I know I'm oftentimes asked within the first day or two of an engagement, hey, what should we do? And I'm thinking, how can you possibly imagine that I can help you set a course of action in a day or two? I haven't even seen your full process yet. I haven't seen it in action. I haven't seen the different people working. And so I call that the Agile coach or consultant dilemma, because you're often asked almost right away to start helping when in fact you haven't observed long enough. And in fact, I would contend, what happens when a team has an outsider visit them for the first week? What is happening to that team? Anyone?
They're feeling judged.
They're feeling judged.
That's the best behavior.
They're on their best behavior, right? And so oftentimes the coach isn't even seeing the real behavior. So it's important that you have, in the readiness, you are establishing that context and then laying the groundwork for values and principles, putting extra emphasis on that, plus tying your Agile deployment to business benefits or the business strategy. That way, because oftentimes implementing Agile is an investment. Investment in mechanics, investment in training, but investment in culture, in cultural change. Yes, Ethan?
Yeah, so, I mean, like, there's some real tough things you're saying on there, like assessing the current environment, engaging willingness. I mean, people are never gonna say, no, I'm not willing, or I don't trust the leadership, or the leadership, so how do you, people aren't gonna speak the truth like that, so how do you?
So I'm gonna go into each one of these in more detail, but this is why it's important for a coach to be able to observe in a non-judgmental way for a little while, so you can start sensing some of that. But if a coach is asked to just get on the team and go figure out how to make them better, you're right, it's never gonna happen. Okay? So a lot of this is about the approach. And what I'm trying to do is set up a much more effective approach than what I often see today. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. Gauge willingness, and then shape. And at that point, you can shape what the implementation is going to look like in a better way. Okay? So, how do we get to that ready? Let's talk about it. So, the first thing I always recommend when you are engaging with a company in Agile is, let's establish a common understanding of what Agile actually is. And usually the first thing I do is I explain to people that Agile is a set of values and principles, nothing more, nothing less. Scrum is not Agile. Scrum is a manifestation of mechanics in attempt to implement those principles. Right? There's XP, there's tools, there's a lot of other elements. And explain what each of those are. Because when I go into a company, there is usually great confusion over what Agile is, and because they're hearing so many other Agile terms, right? Like Scrum, like XP, like the different practice names and tools. How many have seen that? You go into a company, there's like a whole host of definitions and understandings of Agile. Raise your hand. Okay, so not unusual. And it's important to explain the myths. Agile's not no documentation, Agile's not no design, it's not no planning, it's not a team does whatever they want, it's not a silver bullet, it's not one way of doing something, and so forth. And that's important too, because I don't know how many times I've gone into teams and some senior manager is very proud to walk me to this team and say, they're agile. And of course I lift a little bit under the covers, and guess what I find?
Water.
They're doing something, yeah, I find water. They're doing something, and I'm not judging them, but I'm just saying it's not agile. It's like saying if I drove today in a Chevette, how many are familiar with what a Chevette is, right? If I drove in today in a Chevette and I said, hey, I'm driving a vet. How many of you think I'm being genuine here, right? And that's my context with Agile. This isn't really a judgment, but don't say it is something if it isn't. That's all I'm saying. And many people today like to call themselves Agile. Okay? And also, just basically, when you establish a common language, it just adds clarity and it reduces confusion. And there's already going to be enough dissonance in the organization today and amongst people that this is a good place to start. Because a lot of times there'll have been an Agile initiative that has started, and I'll start asking them, so what do you think a retrospective is? What do you think? And this one I get a lot. If I say, what do you think a sprint review is? I get a lot of people who think a review is actually a retrospective, and vice versa. And so there's a lot of confusion around a lot of the terms. The second thing I do is and it's not necessarily in this order, I look at understanding the drivers for the organizational change. Like, why are we doing Agile? And we've already talked about some of them. We said, oh, because it's the bandwagon thing to do. So what I do is I gauge. So you see here, there's kind of a line here. It's really not in any particular order, but what I look at is there's reactive reasons to go Agile, and there's proactive reasons to go Agile. Oftentimes, the reactive reasons are not the right reasons, like trendy. We already talked about that. I'm going Agile because my competitors are going Agile, and I better go Agile, without understanding why. They could be, because what I have today doesn't seem to work, so I'm willing to try anything. I've been in that situation, and Agile did work, but again, they didn't understand why. Could be cost, but then when you start getting the more proactive reasons, well, I want to improve morale. I like that notion of self-organizing teams. I want to improve morale. That's not a bad reason. How about productivity? Productivity is okay as long as it's not, I just want to make my developers work harder. And I've actually been in meetings with CEOs and his directs and heard managers say that. We want to go Agile because we think we can make our developers work harder. That's, again, wrong reason for going Agile. Time to market, value, when it gets to value and belief, those are the right reasons. I believe in the Agile values and principles. I believe in the notion of customer value. That's why we're going Agile. So this is an area that I will work with our senior management, and I'll see what's on their mind. And if it's not quite correct, I'll try to help them and inform them. Okay? In as nice a way as I can. The next is I start introducing the notion of the Agile mindset, which is really the beginning of the education of the values and principles. Quite frankly, that's really what that is getting them to understand behind the values and principles. Oftentimes I use exercises and things like that to start gaining that understanding. And oftentimes, just like here, they've heard of it and they might have seen the values and principles once or twice, but they just blow right by it. And so I reintroduce it to them. Sure. And so what you see down here, I didn't go into it, but I call these beyond the values and principles. Do you see, are you setting the expectation that on a team, no one succeeds unless everyone succeeds? Are you setting the expectation that you need to understand the business value as your driver? are you getting management to step back? But at the same time, are you getting the team to step up? Because it may not be so straightforward. I've had management be willing to step back, but then no one was willing to be a self-organized leader. It's like, then we all have to step up and start volunteering for the work. Okay? So there's a lot more to this you have to think through. I also gauge how important customers and
Mary?
employees.
There was a question over here.
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
On the previous slide, you had exceeds. Did you mean exceeds?
Yeah, it's supposed to be succeeds. Thank you. You must be have a QA background. Thinking, no, I'm just kidding. Thank you. So I also gauge whether the organization is serious about their customers and their employees. Now, what's quite interesting is how many of you believe every customer is going to say, or every company is going to say, customers matter? Raise your hand. So everybody says it. However, oftentimes in a more traditional company, they engage with the customer at the beginning to collect some requirements, and then they engage with them a long time later. And I'm thinking, if customers are so important, if you want to always be engaged with customers, how is that a good practice? Why aren't you continuously engaged with the customer? To me, this isn't even about, forget the word agile. If you tell me that customers matter, why aren't you continuously engaged with your customers? And the same thing with employees. How important is the employee? Are you giving them the ability to self-organize? Are you giving them the ability to drive at least some of their destiny? Now keep in mind, I believe in the concept of bounded authority, meaning it doesn't mean that they can do whatever they want. But whether it's from sprint to sprint or release to release, there are common goals that the team can self-organize around. And either you believe it or you don't. And then I also look for suitability. How many of you have been in companies that somebody at the higher level says, we're all going agile? Raise your hand. Okay, some of you, yeah, more than some.
I'm actually in that position.
You're in that position right now. And so that's a really dangerous thing. Because I'm not quite certain that everybody should go agile. And in fact, I believe it's not a great idea. And here is a suitability framework that I've established that says while anyone can go agile, you really have to ask the question, is the work right? And is it worth the effort of going agile? And so what you see here is at the corner, at your left corner, left bottom corner, you see two axes, product maturity and then investment and growth. If you have a new product where there is expectation of growth and you're putting a lot of effort into it and want to sell it to customers, it's probably not a bad idea to go agile then. I consider that a go. Now this is at a very high level. I'll look at other factors too. But this is a quadrant that I begin with. And then I see this area down here where the product is more mature and the company isn't really investing anymore, or very little, meaning it's more maintenance and things like that. I consider that not a great idea to go agile. That may be too big an investment to make those people change their culture for a product that you may end of life soon or is in maintenance mode. Now I have helped some of those teams transform to agile, but again, you have to think it through. Where are you going to put, much like Agile says, prioritize where you're going to put your effort. This helps you prioritize this suitability framework. Yes?
Can you read that the stop thing? It's very hard to read.
Okay. So it says, more mature product that has limited or shrinking revenue and investment, so may not be worth the cost and effort to move to Agile. Thank you. And then you have potential, which may mean it's still an older product, but they're trying to re-energize the product. Like I was on a product that was based around DB2 tools, but they were trying to put a better front end on it, and we went Agile, and it worked really well. But then I also caution people at the top, it says approach with caution. If the product is doing really well, even if it's a mature product, but it's doing really well, instead of making them go Agile, maybe we should harvest what they're actually doing well. And that's my suggestion. Let's go see what they're actually doing well. Because as some of you may already know, do you know where the whole concept of Agile came about in the first place? Do you think the people in Snowbird got together in 2001 and said, let's invent all of these Agile practices? Do you think that's what they did? No, they harvested practices that align with adaptability. However word that is. Agile. Okay? So the same thing I would do here. So I often introduce and I say, I want to get a gauge from management. How serious are they in considering suitability as a factor? Yes?
Do you think it depends on the type of product? Because I've also heard, for example, building a bridge isn't really the type of product that you might want to use Agile for. So is that also a factor, and where does that fit in?
So I would say it's also a factor. That would be a different type of suitability. Now, I can't speak for a bridge since I've never actually built a bridge, but some people will say customer-facing apps are much better for Agile, with Agile, because you can get feedback, get rapid feedback, whereas like back-end products, you may not be able to, although, but again, a lot of this is where you put your investment in the Agile practice. But I would say generally, yes, I would look at those factors as well. Okay, good, excellent. Yes?
I actually wanted to expand on that. Even a bridge, any project which includes bridges, that'll take a very long time. Sorry, any project that's going to take a very long time to put together, things can change. So for instance, let's say traffic patterns change over the 8 months or something that they're planning a bridge, and they may decide that they need to add some capacity to that or something like that. And in fact, that happened with the Big Dig project. They actually changed the designs of some of the bridges after they were already starting being built because the traffic patterns changed.
So the emphasis here is as long as you continue to get that customer feedback or that feedback, you can adapt along the way. But a lot of this is really about, when I use this, is if I'm only one coach in a company of 1,000, then I use this suitability matrix to determine which projects might better be suited for Agile to gain successes and things earlier. Because there's only one of me or so forth. Thank you. Of course, the all-important executive and stakeholder buy-in. Ultimately, if you don't have strong executive or stakeholder buy-in, particularly if you're trying to do something at an enterprise level, even if it's like a business unit, then it's going to be very challenging because, as you may have already heard me say, a team going Agile isn't enough. It's got to be the whole upline management chain, because we have to be able to be adaptive and change, be willing to change based on customer feedback. So one thing I do, so people ask, well, how would I get that? How would I know if they're engaged, right? If I ask a stakeholder, hey, this is directed to you, Ethan. Hey, if I asked are you gung-ho? Are you for Agile?
Yes.
Exactly. What do most stakeholders say? Sure. Then what I say, great. Now let me give you some tasks to work on. Okay? They have a role in an Agile deployment as well. I'll say, great. So can you help me with funding and resources? And then I'll gauge what their response is. I'll say, will you help me start aligning leadership around Agile? Will you help me with ongoing communications around Agile? Like I had a great, when I was at CA, John Swainson was there as the president of the company. And he was awesome. Anytime we'd want him to send something out, he would do it. In fact, he'd even talk about it. Agile is great. It's, he wouldn't quite say that, but Agile's coming to your corner of the woods, and we'd script something for him, and he'd go out and say it. That's the kind of management and leadership you're looking for. And then I'd also I'd let them know that they have to help mitigate resistance. I'd ask them that they need to promote Agile objectives. Like, it shouldn't just be the team who has Agile objectives, it has to be the management, all the way up to you. And that's how I sense how much alignment and buy-in there really is with stakeholders. Okay. Now, I also, what you don't see here is I also invite them to this, like a sprint review. Any kind of review, I invite them because I want them to see the product being built. And that usually is very helpful. And that's another way that I build stakeholder support, when they see a product getting developed right in front of their eyes. Yes,
And what
Susan?
happens when you run into the issue where they back off?
Okay, what happens when you run into the issue that they back off? Well, then I explain to them that we're introducing a risk. So what I try to do is I don't try to be judgmental. I don't say, you're bad. I just say, well, there's a risk to our Agile adoption here. You may get some adoption, but you're not going to get the transformation. And I just point it out, just so they understand. It's not, again, it's not a judgment. Good question. Yes?
How the management, like their funding and resourcing, they will see, I mean, they would obviously expect the results. How do they measure that movement to Agile?
Yeah, so the question is, if the management is willing to fund and give you some resources, how do they measure that there has been some success? There's actually a slide that talks about that, so I want to hold that thought. But you do, there has to be some way to look at it, so hold that thought, but good question. Messaging is very important. So it's talking about senior management and some of the things that they could do, but I often ask the management team to create a communication vision on how they plan to spread the word on Agile, to create the buzz, listen to concerns. And here's where I start using a lot of appropriate channels. Okay, it could be the website, it could be town halls, it could be a blog, it could be a lot of different ways to message and to channel the energy of the organization. Because a lot of times what I see is the organization starts getting frenetic about it. And it's like, well, but let's start directing some of their energy in the right direction. Because I want some of the champions to start giving back. I also want to make sure that we're aligning storytelling. Storytelling is a very powerful technique to make sure we're messaging properly. And I introduced that technique to management. When you start telling a story, incorporate one of the principles. How this team was successful when they self-organized. Start messaging in that manner. And also there's going to be a need to adapt rewards. If we keep rewarding heroics, then that's what people are going to do, right? So you got to adapt the rewards as well. This is all part of messaging. Yes?
Yeah, I just think you're gonna get stuck on something that's like, listening to concerns, it's the same type of thing. So like, and we've definitely seen in our organization where the people who are actually doing Agile, like you said, and maybe it's not working so well, but there's no way to bubble that up to the, right, because they're not going to say, hey,
Pretend to be Agile.
Yeah.
They pretend to be Agile.
Yeah, and so this is where I say using the appropriate channels. So one of the things that I've done in a couple of places where if you had a website, you'd have a place to express concerns, but we also had social discussion groups. So you could put the concerns there so everybody could see them. And I use that a lot because then I could share that with the senior managers. So like, look, it's not just me saying it, you see whole threaded conversation surrounding this concern. So I make sure that there are multiple channels by which those can be addressed. Now the next question becomes, will they actually get addressed? And so to me, that's like one big retrospective, because there should be retrospectives happening at different levels. And here's where, at a certain point, you would focus on, say, the top 2 or 3 concerns at a time, because there's other business going on. Okay. But the channeling, giving them a place to put their concerns is very important. Otherwise, they start to feel like they don't matter. Okay, so the other thing I suggest is treat your transformation as if it was an initiative. Don't just kind of let it happen. Treat it as if, give it a name. Because like the saying, if you do not manage culture, it will manage you. So it doesn't mean you have a big project plan or anything like that, but if you're planning to introduce 2 coaches to the organization, put together a vision around that. Make sure it's clear, because some of this has got to be messaged to other teams. Like, I know oftentimes if I coach one team, people start to hear about it. And they want coached, and they want to know how to get coached. And so if you put together a little bit of a program around it, then that really helps the organization. It also helps with messaging. I also look at the state of engineering and Agile. I want to get a baseline on where things are today. So if an organization is saying they're Agile and they're bringing me in, that often means that there's probably a little trouble afoot. And so I will do an Agile assessment where I actually collect their input. This isn't based on my observations, this is based on their input. So that way that gives me a baseline of where they are. If they say they're doing Scrum, I will give them an assessment based on Scrum, just to see if they're really doing Scrum. I also include engineering elements, and that means like QA and development standards and configuration management. Because what I often find is, when I go into an organization, there's usually huge issues with QA, like not enough QA. And then you decide to go Agile, and guess what everybody does? They blame Agile for not having enough QA, when in fact you started that way. So to me it's very important that you gauge the engineering conditions. Maybe practices, processes, things like that. Like, what is the current situation of Agile and engineering? Okay.
So it comes down to tools again. What kind of tools do you do to make the assessment?
So the question was, so this comes down to tools. What kind of tools do you use? Well, if you look in my book, you'll see some of those answers.
So are they what, paper tests? Are they online tests?
Yeah, so they're not really tests. I'm actually asking them for their input. I'm asking them, because oftentimes what I have found, this is actually a beautiful thing, particularly on the engineering side. Engineers are very honest. You know, if you tell, well, how's this daily stand-up going? Oh, I hate it. It's like 30 minutes long, right? Or it's an hour long, right? And I'll be like, well, if it's an hour long, it's probably not a daily stand-up, but let's go figure out what it is. And so the good news is I want to hear directly from them. And oftentimes I will get very honest information. And some of it depends on the situation, and sometimes they're dying to tell you the situation. How many have been in that scenario, right? They're dying to tell you how either bad or good it is. And so I always seek out their information. Okay? Because this helps set the context of where you need to go next. Of course, you have to start talking about a framework, whatever that framework is. I don't talk too much about that because there's tons of books out there, but what is important is you need to establish a framework. Are you using Scrum? Are you using XP? Are you using Kanban? Doesn't really matter, although much like suitability for Agile, I also look at suitability for the methods. Okay? Some methods are a little bit more suitable than others. And I also find, particularly with Scrum, but even with Kanban, is people add additional elements to it. If you have 2 Scrum teams, and they need to keep in collaboration, what else would you implement? A Scrum of Scrums, right? And so that's the other area that I'd look at. Okay? But this is important in readiness because you can't start implementing some Agile method until you've had this discussion, right? And key to this is I'm looking for optimization of end-to-end. And that's why I often find that Scrum isn't enough. I need more than that. Other engineering practices, start adding some XP practices and a few other things to really get that end-to-end from idea to delivery. And of course, scaling. The more scaling you have to consider, if If you have distributed teams, you have to consider that. And so I do a lot of this work, but again, because there's a lot of material out there on this, I don't cover it as much in my book, other than making sure that you are alerted to these elements. And then we talk about team willingness and capability. Capability is fairly straightforward. I just usually ask them if you had any formal training. Go around the room, hey, who's had formal training? How many years of experience have you had? And again, this is why I love engineers. I'll ask them flat out, do you think you really have a good handle on Agile? And you know, some will and some won't. They'll be usually honest about it. But willingness is a harder thing. I think this is what you're getting to, Ethan. And this is where observation is important as a coach or a consultant. That you have the ability and time to observe. So you can start seeing whether they are or not. Whether they're becoming resistant to your suggestions. Okay? And I also talk with the team. And you know, usually again, engineers, they're pretty straightforward. They'll say, oh, he never collaborates. And so, okay, well that's good to know. But it's important to know what the dynamics are happening within your team before you start. And then of course, you have to figure out how you're going to adapt the team structure. So you have to think about these things. It doesn't just happen. And so I look at moving from much more vertical to a horizontal world where teams aren't just directly reporting to a functional manager, but of course they're working within a team context with the product owner, scrum master, or whatever the agile term is that you happen to be using. And so this also takes some examination. So for example, scrum master. I've written an article called, you know, who makes the best scrum master? And the answer, unfortunately, is not, hey, if you're a project manager, you make a good scrum master. It's not that at all. It's if you exhibit certain attributes. So you have to be able to observe as well as have people be willing to be the scrum master. Okay? So there's a lot of discussion in my book about this because it's important to make that assessment. The same thing with product owner. Who could be a good product owner? Okay. And then I highly recommend establishing what I call an education vision. Because Agile is really about continuous learning. You are not going to be Agile-minded by taking 1 2-day Scrum Master certification class. In fact, that is the tip of the iceberg. You need to make people aware. So you may have awareness seminars. You may actually have training, either face-to-face or web-based. It could be on process, tools, roles. But there should also be guidance in the form of coaching and mentoring. There should also be reading material available, whether it's the blog, books, journals, things like that. And then ultimately, as part of an education vision, I look for people in the organization who are willing to give back. Because ultimately, I want to create an organization of Agile champions. That's the ultimate goal. And they're willing to give back and do some of the seminars and blogs and even training. Okay, when I was at CA, I created 25 trainers, Agile champion trainers, who were happy to do training across the CA globe. And then I also created a coaching network of 12 coaches. So it can be done because there's oftentimes people are willing to give back. And then finally, you need to establish your measures of success. And this is where I often see the wrong thing being measured. So if you are, however, at different points along your journey, you may need to measure different things. Like, you're going to need some measures that will help you understand if you are doing Agile. Like, I just invested $50,000 to get 300 people trained in Scrum. And so I may have measures that focus on, A, are they doing Scrum, and how are they doing with the Scrum practices? Or it could be a measure on just training. But this just gets into the doing Agile part. Okay? But that's still ground level metrics. It's not bad, but that doesn't tell you that you are agile. The more important are the second and third bullets. The second is are you being agile? Those are the kind of measures you want. And with that, do you remember the agile principles I shared with you guys? I actually create an agile metrics assessment based on that. I call it Agile Mindset, Values, and Principles Evaluator. And it's also in the book. And this gets to, and again, I ask the team. I don't make an assessment myself, I ask the team. And this starts to get me to understand, are they really making that mindset shift? And then finally, I look at, are you actually receiving the business benefits of doing Agile? And are we measuring that? And in my book, I introduced the concept of lagging to leading metrics. Because the ultimate measure in Agile is your outcome or your revenue. However, that's a lagging metric. So what kind of metrics can you put in place to ensure that you will get to a more successful revenue metric, or at least know along the way whether you will or won't get there? Okay, did I see a question? Yes?
Were you going to give a couple of examples of the measurement of being agile?
Not here, but they're in my book. I knew we were, this is a whole session in and of itself. So for me to flash it up, it would just cause a little bit more concern, and people would like to see it more. It would be a whole session in and of itself, which I'd be happy to talk with you after the session. Actually, if anybody would be interested, I'd be happy to share some of that. Okay? So, with that in mind, we're getting ready to wrap up the session. And some of your takeaways should be that now you understand clearly that Agile is nothing more, nothing less than what? A set of values and principles. And the key to Agile is getting into the state of being, or being Agile, not just mechanically doing it. Also, you need to get yourself aligned. Agile needs to be aligned with your business strategy. You're doing Agile ultimately to deliver customer value, and you hope it will gain you business revenue. There is a strong focus on that customer value. And then the last I'll leave you with, it is important to get ready for your Agile adventure, because the Agile adventure often takes a couple of years to really get to that culture. Okay. So with that, any remaining questions before I wrap up? Yes?
I wonder if you could relate the Agile values and principles and the readiness to Agile sustainability. Because a couple of months ago we had Amir here talking on Agile sustainability. And I can think of some very initially successful, highly visible Agile transformations, Salesforce.com, State Farm, your experience at Fidelity, Jeff Sutherland's experience at IDX and at Partners and all that, at Patient Keeper. And it seemed that these very successful transformations would be completely obliterated if you change one key person. And what can you do so that when that key person goes on to their next venture, that it doesn't all collapse behind them?
And so the first thing you want to watch out for is, and you mentioned it a couple of times, you don't want to hinge all your bets on one key person. So even though you may initially have a sponsor who is at a very senior level, you look for buy-in at all the levels in between as well. And you look for sincere buy-in. And while that can certainly happen, what I have found is if you're trying to get, and this gets that notion of Agile champions, I talked about giving back. If you're really building a culture where people start to give back, then they'll want Agile whether there's a senior manager there asking them to do it or not. And so I really push the whole concept of giving back. And when I do that, I find that particularly those business units still will not do it any other way, no matter what they're told. Okay, but those business units where we don't have the champions lined up, then that's exactly what happens. Very good question. Anything else? Yes, go ahead.
One of the things that I've found to be almost a leading indicator of the giving back kind of culture is, as an early sign, is just the participating kind of culture. People who are willing to just get out there and experience it and learn.
Yeah, willing to step up. I call that willing to step up and be assertive. And so that's definitely a factor that you look at. I looked that up in willingness as well. And this is where another thing that I do as a coach is I start assessing who really are Agile champions, and I start to ask them to start doing some things for me. Okay, like right now I'm at a company where their very first Lean Agile forum, they asked me to speak. It went really well, and now they want me to speak again. And my first response was, can we get someone else to speak? Because getting to Dave's point, I don't want to be the only, elephant in the jungle, as he says. I don't want to be the only voice of Agile. I want to start building other Agile champions. Okay. Yes, Ethan.
Just hypothetically, what do you do if you're like in the middle of a big organization and you're told to, do Agile? How do you kind of change that culture upwards so that?
So you're in the middle of a big organization, and who's telling you to go Agile?
Upper management.
Your upper management.
But they're just sort of telling you to
try it out, maybe?
get to do the mechanics of Agile. It doesn't seem like they're kind of on the doing phase. They want to see that you're doing it, but they're not focusing on it.
And so that is, I would say, the more common scenario, that management comes to a team and says, go do Agile. Well, so the first thing I would do is I'd ask, well, can you give me some training? I'd want to get a sense of at least what level of commitment they're willing to do. Because if they're saying they're not willing to give me any training, then you're kind of in a really lose-case scenario. I mean, you can try a few things and see how it goes, but to me it's very important to always be assessing your stakeholder. Like, what level of commitment, and plus I'd want to know, do they have my back? Because if they're asking me to go Agile and I have a release I have to deliver at a certain time, I mean, and I know that's what I get rewarded on, I'd want to get a sense of that as well. So I'd be looking at a lot of these red flags scenarios. Okay. Yes?
Question is, you have a team who has no exposure to Agile, and they have been waterfall for 10 years, say, and then you have a product where you have potential in the middle of the grid you have. How long it takes? First of all, inducting the principles and getting the values, then making them to follow. How, in your experience, how long it takes? 6 months, 3 months, 6 months?
Oh boy, that's not an easy question to answer, because I'd be doing a lot of the activities in the readiness that I just told you about. I'd be looking at a lot of those and see what risk factors I would come into. Do I have management support? Do I have any funding to get them trained? Can I bring in a coach? A lot of this kind of stuff. I'd be looking at all that first before I could really tell you anything.
A lot of time it becomes pressure.
A lot of times it becomes pressure. You're quite correct.
Somebody in the group is doing, so you better move your team to be Agile,
Yes. And that's called bandwagon. So how sustainable do you think that model is?
I don't know.
Yeah, that's usually not very sustainable. And what I'm trying to tell you here is a lot of these success factors are supposed to clue you in whether this is really going to be happening and sustainable or not. Whether I'm really getting to being Agile or not. Because what happens for many of us is we're in an organization that's calling themselves Agile. We're not really sure. What hopefully you walk out of here saying, I kind of know now. I have a better sense of that now. And again, there's no judgment here. It's just, don't call it Agile if it's not really Agile. Or don't call it Scrum if you're not really following the mechanics of Scrum. Things like that. That's all I'm saying. It's still okay to explore and to experiment. Yeah, and then, but start mitigating some of these risks along the way, especially to your own self as you move forward. Anything else? Okay, with that, I thank you all very much. Great participation. And then what I'll leave you with is, even though the price is $25, we're gonna raffle off 3 books, and I'm gonna actually have them available for $20, which is 50% off, if you'd like them. So let's do the raffle. Okay.
So you're right.